So this video is for patching and painting a small drywall hole. So I just wrote a whole thing on it. I've done hundreds of these. So the goal for me is to repair the hole so it's smooth and visible and blends with surrounding walls. So I always, when I do my holes, when I do my patches, I always dare the customer to find the patch. And that's kind of what my goal is, that they can't find it and they can't see it. Materials and tools needed is utility knife, sanding sponge, 6-inch and 12-inch drywall taping knives, drywall patch. I like to use a drywall patch. I do not like using mesh, just mesh over a hole. Joint compound spackle, drywall screws. I do like to fasten my piece into wood. I know there's a lot of people that do the blowout patch, not really my thing. Paint, make sure that the paint is matched to the wall. Primer, super important. Paintbrush, roller, dust mask, drop cloths. So the first thing that I do, number one, is I lay down a drop cloth to protect the floor. I usually have a dust mask because when I'm cutting or using sheetrock, there can be dust. I always check for studs and wirings behind the wall with a stud finder just to make sure there's nothing behind there. I don't want to screw into a pipe. I ask the customer sometimes, is there anything that you know in that area that could be, any pipes or any electrical stuff, just to make sure. And I just check the hole, check the area, make sure if there's any loose debris, anything chipping. I kind of use my 5-in-1 or, my sanding block just to kind of clear the area. So number two is cutting my patch for sheetrock. And so what I like to do, let's say there's a little hole, the hole is about maybe 6 inches. I like to cut a perfect square piece of sheetrock. And I make sure that my sheetrock matches the sheetrock on the wall. So there's all different sizes of sheetrock. There's 1/2 inch, there's 1/4 inch. So I want to make sure I have the right size sheetrock for the patch. So I cut a perfect square piece of sheetrock, and then I place that square right over the middle of the hole, and I trace around that square piece of sheetrock. Then I like to use a utility knife because if you can use a sheetrock saw, but again, you're kind of going into the wall more and you could hit something if you don't know what's behind it. So I just use my utility knife. I go over it multiple times until it comes out. And now I have a perfect patch piece of sheetrock and the perfect shape in the wall that matches perfectly. So number three, I like to add support. So for me, I like to get a piece of wood, mattering the size of the hole, sometimes two, but usually if it's a small hole, I can get a piece of wood that is longer than the hole, and I screw in the piece of wood on the top part of the sheetrock that's still there, the longer part, and the bottom, and I stabilize that. And now I can screw my piece of sheetrock into that piece of wood and stabilizing it. For me, I like that. I feel like it's more stable than just doing a blowout patch, but that's just me. So number four is I apply spackle and mesh tape. For me, I love to use powder spackle called Easy Sand. It dries faster and it dries harder. I love Easy Sand. It's my go-to product. So the first thing I do is I use my 6-inch knife to apply the Easy Sand compound over the seams. Basically, I just make everything even, and then I put my mesh tape. Some people mesh before they spackle. I don't like doing that. I feel like that can leave gaps. So I like to spackle, then mesh tape the area, and then I take my knife and get all the loose spackle and make sure it's nice and even and there's not a lot of excess spackle. After I do that, I let it dry completely. I always have a fan on me. I love bringing fans because it really allows the spackle to dry faster. Since I use Easy Sand, it actually dries super fast, mattering which one you use. But whatever anyone is using, just look at the directions and they'll usually tell you how long something dries for. Usually they suggest to wait 24 hours, and I just make sure that it's completely dry. So number five, I go and sand it smooth. I use a block usually. I make sure the whole area is smooth. I feel it with my hand. I make sure that there's nothing caved in, that everything is nice and even. And then I wipe off all the dust with a rag and cloth. That's number five. Number six is the second coat. Again, I use the Easy Sand. I love it. But now I want to use a bigger knife. So usually I use a 10 or a 12-inch knife, and I want to feather out the edges so that the patch is completely even and seamless so that you can't see it. So after I do that, I get all the excess off. I want it to be completely even, feathered out on all sides, so it's flush. And again, I let that dry again. I like to use the fan to dry it faster. And then number 7, we're at the final sand and touch up. Again, you just want to look at and make sure you got no bubbles, just make sure the area is completely perfect. Use a sander. I like to use a finer. On the last one, I use kind of like a finer sanding block, maybe 220. And then I just make sure everything is nice and flush, no lines, everything's nice and even. And after that, number 8 is priming and painting. So priming is super important. If you skip priming, you could be in trouble. Um, Sometimes people will just use the paint right over it, and if you do that, you can get bubbles. So you do want to prime the patch. You want to prime the spackle, which seals it. So after you prime it, you want to let the prime basically dry. Again, just make sure everything's completely dry before you do it. And number 9 is paint to match. So this is super important. So if the homeowner doesn't have the exact paint for that wall that they used, and you just get the name of the paint somewhere else, it may not match. So you may have to paint the whole wall. So super important that you have the right paint, you have the exact paint that matches, and then you could just paint the area. So just a little tip in this area, because this part is super important. So when you're beginning to paint the patched area, you want to look at the other aspects of the wall and just see what it looks like. If there's a lot of texture, you want to make sure you use a roller that creates texture on the patch, because otherwise, let's say you use a brush to paint it, you're going to have 2 different textures. You're going to have a flat texture, and then if the walls have a lot of texture from, a heavy roller, you're going to have 2 different textures, and it's not going to match. So you want to make sure that you match the texture when you're painting painting over the patch. And then after that, after you paint the patch, you just want to make sure everything looks good and clean. Always check your work. Things happen. And number 10 is just cleanup, right? You just want to pick up your drop cloths, your tools, any dust. You want to just clean up. Let the customer always inspect the area. Like I said, I like to dare the customer to find where I patched, and usually they can't find it. And super important. So the tips that I have is just not to skip primer. Make sure that the paint matches. Feathering out the spackle is super important, and the wall texture. Make sure before you pick your rollers that it matches the texture. Always have extra things on hand because things happen. And that is my video for the patch.